Dorothy always woke up at the same time in the morning, 6:30 in the morning, as scheduled. Even if the night was restless, if she had to stay in bed until midnight, her eyes would still open by themselves at 6:30, as if someone invisible was ringing an alarm clock inside her head. James was sleeping next to her, loudly, with some special sound that she had learned to ignore over 30 years of marriage. Her brain just stopped noticing that snoring solo in the silence of the night. Her signature tea had already been prepared in the kitchen. In advance, it was always brewed in the evening, so that in the morning just pour it into a mug and warm it up. It was such a small ritual, part of the very routine that could drive you crazy if you thought about it too long. She was standing at the stove stirring tea with a spoon and looking out the window. There was a small garden behind the glass, in which James had long promised to install a new bench. But the bench, of course, remained a promise. James walked slowly over to the kitchen table, scratching his head possessively.
You're up early again.
As always. In the morning, silence, you can only hear the kettle hissing. Otherwise, with your snoring, you won't get much rest at night.
Snoring, so I'm still bothering you. Are you really complaining about your old husband?
Where is it going? I'm used to it, like tinnitus, I just think sometimes what a life this is. It's the same thing every day. Everything seems to be fine, but there is not enough fresh air.
Dorothy put a cup of his coffee in front of James, bitter, black, as he liked it. James looked at her in mild surprise.
What are you talking about, honey? What are you missing? We're here together. There is a house, a job, children and their families. Isn't that enough?
I don't know. Maybe not enough. Or a lot. I don't understand with a slight smile, like in.
You're always with these thoughts. You remember old songs. I thought you'd calmed down a long time ago.
Maybe she calmed down. But something's eating at you, James. I don't really know how to explain it to you.
She waved her hand as if trying to dismiss her own thoughts. These conversations began to be repeated more and more often. It was as if they both stepped on the same corn over and over again every day, but no one knew how to heal it. James got up and looked around their kitchen, so familiar, with a slightly scratched table that they had bought when the children were little. All these details which had once pleased him now seemed, well, just things.
So what do you suggest? To rush somewhere? Go to the ocean, like we always said.
It's going somewhere again. Where are we going, James? I'm not thinking about traveling anymore. Tell me, how do I live so that I can return to myself?
Come back to yourself? What are you talking about? Do you really have anything to doubt? You're doing fine? Everyone loves you?
That's weird. Everyone loves me, everything is fine, but I don't recognize myself. Sometimes I remember what I used to be like. Funny, cheeky. And now I'm looking in the mirror, and who is it?
James scratched his chin thoughtfully. He knew that she sometimes went into these strange, incomprehensible thoughts. But what to do about it, how to react to it at all, he did not know.
You've always been too deep for me, Dorothy. I just want to live. It's simple. But you're always looking for something more.
And maybe that's the problem. I'm not looking anymore.
They finished their morning coffee in silence. It was their usual silence, the one that had accumulated over the years and years of marriage. There was no anger or resentment in that silence. It was just that. After breakfast, James was going to his job, and then everything was repeated, as if according to a script that they knew by heart. Her thoughts began to slip away from her in the morning hours. As if gnawed by a worm of melancholy, she began to see life in a different way, with this grey veil, as they say. When James walked out the door, Dorothy returned to the kitchen table, where his cup of half-finished coffee was still on it. For a second, she wanted to just throw that cup away, as if that action could change their lives. Later in the afternoon, when James returned from work, they had dinner together in almost complete silence. This silent room reminded Dorothy more and more of what she was missing. Maybe it would still be possible to return that spark, but how? After all she had were habits, routine, and James by her side.
Dorothy, have you ever thought that we could? Well, I don't know, change the situation? Maybe we should go visit our people.
And what's there? All the same conversations. I just want to. I want to find something of my own, James. Something that's only mine, you know?
Am I bothering you to be yourself?
No, it's not about you. It's like I've lost myself.
He put down his fork and sighed, trying not to get annoyed.
You've confused yourself. That's what I think. You're always digging into the past instead of enjoying what's there now.
Maybe so. But I remember the me I used to be. I was brave, passionate, and now I'm afraid to take my mind off the usual for even 5 minutes. It's like I'm living on a schedule, like a notebook.
James seemed a little embarrassed, as if he realized that there was truth in her words, but did not want to admit it.
Brave, then. Okay, maybe you really need a distraction. Take a day for yourself. Go somewhere, chat with old friends. Why are you sitting at home?
Thanks for the advice, James. But if it was just that, I would have done something long ago. It's more than just going out for coffee with someone.
Well, maybe you need to stop looking for something beyond. We live here together, we're living, and that's enough, Dorothy.
She smiled sadly at him. He didn't understand, but he couldn't understand either, because he didn't feel what was weighing on her. The following week, Dorothy went to the grocery store as usual. Picking up the cart and already habitually making her way between the shelves, she suddenly heard a familiar, slightly velvety voice somewhere behind her. The voice was so familiar and yet so far away that her heart stopped for a second. She turned slowly and saw him, Marcus, her first love.
Dorothy. God, how many years have passed? Is it really you?
Dorothy blinked several times as if she couldn't believe her eyes. Standing in front of her was a man she hadn't seen in decades, but whom she once seemed to know better than anyone. Marcus looked a little older. His hair was completely grey now, but there were still sparkles in his eyes, as when they met in their youth.
Marcus, is that really you? How many years have passed?
Marcus slowly approached her, staring intently, as if trying to make sure that it was really her.
It's been too long to count, right? I didn't even think I'd be able to meet you here, among the shelves of bread and milk.
I can't believe it. When did you get back? Or didn't you leave at all?
I have recently returned. I've been to a lot of places over the years, but now he returned to his native land. And you. You're still the same.
Dorothy chuckled, feeling her heart strangely ache. Something in his words caused her to have mixed feelings, bitterness, and an unexpected wave of memories.
I doubt it's the same. It's been so many years I'm not the same girl who laughed at your jokes anymore, Marcus.
Well, you're wrong, Dorothy. There's something about you. There's something about you. The smile, the look, the eyes are still shining.
She was embarrassed, as she used to be when he looked at her like that in his youth. Back then, she thought his gaze was the deepest and most understanding of all. And now that look was back in front of her, and suddenly her everyday life, her routine, all this faded in front of this real, living feeling.
I thought about you sometimes, you know, especially when it was lonely. I don't think you can imagine how many times I've regretted that it turned out that way back then.
The past is the past, Marcus. We haven't been who we were back then for a long time.
Maybe so, but I can't deny that meeting you here is. Let's just say it makes you think.
They both fell silent for a second, feeling the silence grow tense. Marcus finally cleared his throat and offered,
Why don't we go out for coffee? After all, so many years have passed. We can just talk. Like old friends, right?
Dorothy looked at him thoughtfully. A thought flashed through her mind about James, about the house, about what she was supposed to do tonight. But something inside was whispering, why not?
Good. I think I can spare an hour. After all, it's just a conversation.
They settled down in a small coffee shop not far from the store. Marcus ordered black coffee and Dorothy chose tea, as before. That made Marcus chuckle.
Tea, as always. You haven't changed, Dorothy.
Well, habits are like a second self. You seem to be ordering the same coffee yourself.
Maybe we both haven't changed as much as we think.
But life has changed after all. Marriage, children, work. These are no longer the days when we dreamed of distant lands and great things.
Are you still dreaming, Dorothy? Or has all this routine killed the girl in you that you once were?
His question caught her off guard. She turned away, looking out the window. What is she dreaming about? When was the last time she dreamed of something for real? Since she married James, her life has turned into a series of predictable steps without the vivacity that once was in her.
Sometimes. Maybe I didn't even forget to dream. It's just that my dreams have changed. Or I made myself believe it.
And what, Dorothy? Isn't it possible to dream now? Does age, marriage, or anything else prevent us from looking for ourselves?
She thought about his words. They seemed so simple, but maybe that was the whole point. She forgot that you can be yourself, not a wife, not a mother, not part of the family routine, but just yourself.
Tell me honestly, are you happy? No need to answer out of politeness, just honestly, are you happy?
Happy. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe not. I even stopped thinking about it.
Marcus reached out, gently touching her palm.
Dorothy, I know it's not that easy right now, but maybe this is a chance? A chance to at least remember who you were.
She took her hand away, but that touch left a mark in her heart. It was as if Marcus had stirred up all her fears, insecurities, and lost dreams.
Marcus, this is all so unexpected. I came to the store for bread, not to look for myself.
They both laughed, and it was a real laugh, light, like when they were young. She felt that she was alive again, that her heart was not locked in a routine.
I'm glad I could meet you. And you know what? I'm not leaving yet. If you just want to talk or have a coffee, you know where to find me.
Maybe. I'll think about it.
Marcus paid and helped her get up from the table. They said goodbye, and she felt a slight jolt in her heart again. As soon as he left, Dorothy felt like she was alone with her thoughts and feelings, with this new or long-forgotten freedom inside. It had been a few weeks since Dorothy and Marcus had met at the coffee shop, but thoughts of him haunted her. She often returned to memories of the past, and to the words he had said to her. These words seemed to take root in her mind, tearing her feelings in two. She knew that her life had long since found its usual, calm rhythm, but the strange excitement that meetings with Marcus brought did not let her go. In the evening, when James left to meet with friends, Dorothy decided to meet Marcus again. She called him, and his voice, as always, was full of warmth.
Marcus, I was thinking maybe we could go for a walk again? Just like that time in the park.
I've been waiting for your call, Dorothy. Of course, let's meet.
They met again in the park, which seemed to keep their secrets and memories. The evening air was cool, and when Marcus saw her, he took off his scarf and draped it over her shoulders.
You've always been so fragile but strong inside. How are you, Dorothy? Is everything okay?
I'm not sure. Every time we meet, I feel like I'm walking on thin ice. I'm scared, Marcus.
I know, but I'm here with you. I'm not going anywhere. You can trust me.
They walked slowly along the path strewn with fallen leaves, and her heart was beating faster with every step. Marcus walked beside her, barely touching her shoulder, but it was enough for her to feel something long forgotten awakening in her again.
Marcus, I keep thinking. How did it happen that we lost each other then? Why was everything so difficult?
Do you remember how we dreamed of leaving? We were young and naive. You were afraid to leave your family, and I thought the world was waiting for me. Except I was wrong. I didn't find anything worth you.
Dorothy stopped, her gaze filled with sadness and disappointment.
And here we are again, after all these years. It's like we're going back to the beginning, but now it's even more complicated. We have a past, we have obligations. I do not know how this is possible.
Marcus gently hugged her, and she felt his warmth warming her. This hug reminded her of her younger years when she felt truly loved.
Don't think about what's impossible. Let's just be here and now, without encumbrances.
They walked slowly along the park again, and the conversation seemed to become more and more frank, as if they could no longer contain their feelings.
Every time I'm with you, it's like I'm finding myself. But what happens then? How can I go back to my old life?
Maybe it's not worth going back to the old one. You deserve to be happy, even if it means breaking the usual order of things.
Her heart sank at those words. Dorothy knew he was right, but it was unbearably difficult to realize. A few days after this meeting, Dorothy found herself back with Marcus in the same park. It became their little secret hideout. They were sitting on the same bench, and Marcus took her hand, stroking her palm, as if hoping to convey his support to her.
Marcus, I think about it every time and I feel like I have to stop. It's all wrong. We are no longer young lovers. I have a family, a husband to whom I owe a debt.
How do you feel about me, Dorothy? You don't have to answer out of a sense of duty. You can be honest.
She froze, and the silence between them became filled with tension. For the first time in years, she wanted to really answer this question honestly.
I feel alive when I'm with you, Marcus. But it's weird. I still feel like I'm betraying James even just by dating you.
You don't betray anyone unless you betray yourself. You have a right to be happy, Dorothy. I'm not asking you to choose me, but I'm asking you to choose yourself.
These words seemed to break through the barriers that she had been building all her life. Dorothy suddenly realized that Marcus was the only person who really saw her for real, without all those masks and roles that she wore in the family. With each new meeting, they revealed their souls to each other more and more. Conversations, touches, glances, all this began to remind her of who she once was and what she had lost over the years of marriage and caring for her family. One evening, when they were sitting on the bench again, Marcus looked at her especially deeply.
Have you ever thought that we could be together? Not now, maybe, but in the future.
I'm afraid to think about it. If I imagine this, how will I be able to return home? How can I look James in the eye?
I know it's not easy, but I want you to know that no matter what you decide, I will always be here. I won't push, I won't rush. Just know that I am.
Those words sent a wave of warmth and fear through her at the same time. She knew that he was saying this from the heart, and she felt that she couldn't just cut it short, even if she wanted to.
Marcus, I'm not sure I deserve this. You give me too much, and I'm afraid I won't be able to return the favor.
You respond by opening up to me, Dorothy. You're showing me the self I knew and loved. That's all I'm asking.
With each meeting, two forces fought in Dorothy's heart. One wanted to return to her usual life, to James, to her family, but the other, the one that had awakened in her thanks to Marcus, longed for freedom, longed to live for herself, as she had not allowed herself for a long time. That night, after returning home from another meeting, Dorothy sat in her bedroom and thought about what had happened. Her heart was torn between duty and the feeling she could no longer suppress. James was used to the fact that his life with Dorothy was measured and calm. Over the years of their marriage, he had learned to appreciate the routine in which they lived and believed that they had achieved a kind of quiet happiness, hidden from the outside world. It was almost inconceivable to him that life could somehow shake this well-established foundation. Each of their days was similar to the previous one, but he did not see anything wrong with it. On the contrary, he considered it a guarantee of stability and family happiness. However, lately he had begun to notice something strange about Dorothy's behavior. At first, it was the little things. Her gaze became distant, and sometimes she went into her own thoughts, even when they spent time together. She began to stay out of the house more and more often, take long walks, and returned with such a strange, seemingly enlightened expression on her face. James tried to ignore it, writing it off as an accident, or perhaps an aggravation of her melancholy. He knew that Dorothy often thought about life, and he was used to not interfering with her at such moments. But as time went on, it began to worry him. One evening, when Dorothy returned late, he noticed traces on her coat, something like autumn leaves stuck to the fabric, as if she had been sitting somewhere on the street or in the park for a long time. James noticed it immediately, but didn't show it. He just quietly watched as she carefully took off her coat and hung it in the closet without saying a word. Her hands were shaking, and he suddenly felt an anxiety rising in his heart, which he could not get rid of. At that moment, James realized that his familiar world was about to change. In the days that followed, he tried to keep an eye on her unnoticed, looking for the slightest signs of change. It would seem that he knew her by heart, knew her every habit, every gesture, but now it began to seem to him that he was living next to someone completely different. He noticed that Dorothy began to pay more attention to her appearance, although she had never really thought about how she looked before. Now her morning began with standing in front of the mirror for a long time, carefully choosing clothes and applying light makeup. James sensed that she was trying to hide something, but he couldn't figure out what it was. After a while, he came across her old notebook, which he remembered from their youth. Dorothy usually kept the numbers of close friends and a list of things to do for the week there. This time, when he accidentally saw her on the table, one name caught his eye: Marcus. It was a name he vaguely remembered from Dorothy's conversations about her youth, but he had never given it much thought. Marcus was something distant, insignificant to him, a part of her past that had nothing to do with their current life. However, now that he saw the name, James felt a strange pang of jealousy. Doubts began to grow, like a blur that took over more and more space in his mind. James tried to find a logical explanation for everything that was happening, to calm himself down, but his inner voice kept saying that something was wrong here. He began to mentally replay all her recent absences and mysterious walks. Gradually, the conviction grew stronger in his heart that there was more between Dorothy and this Marcus than just friendship. He remembered Dorothy talking about her first love, but it always seemed so far away, as if it was happening in another world. She talked about Marcus with a certain sadness and warmth, but James never saw this as a threat to their marriage. However, now that all these details began to add up to one picture, he suddenly realized that this part of her past had never completely disappeared. She continued to live inside her, as part of herself. The realization baffled him. James always believed that they had lived a life of peace and mutual understanding together. He believed that he was her only love. And now, with a completely different story unfolding before him, he felt betrayed. A couple of days later, James decided to follow Dorothy when she left the house again under the pretext of a long walk. He felt terrible, but his suspicions were too strong to ignore. He followed her at a considerable distance, watching her walk slowly down the street, as if lost in her thoughts. She reached a small park and stopped at a bench where someone else was already sitting. This someone stood up, and James instantly recognized him. It was Marcus. He saw how they greeted each other, how Marcus touched her hand, and how her face lit up in response to this gesture. This was the last straw for James. He couldn't believe his eyes. In front of him was his wife, the same woman he had lived with for 30 years, and now she was looking at another man with that warmth and joy that he hadn't seen in her gaze for a very long time. It seemed to him that his whole world was collapsing. All the years they had spent together, all their shared memories and moments, all seemed lost and meaningless in light of what he had just seen. James got home before her, but he couldn't get rid of the vision of Dorothy looking at Marcus for a second. He felt that everything inside him was turning over. The memories of their life together, how they raised children together, built a house and shared every day, now seemed to him something alien, almost deceptive. He realized that Dorothy might have always remained somewhere deep inside the other, and he had never really known her. This feeling filled him with longing, and at the same time he felt anger mixed with pain. When Dorothy returned, she noticed that James looked different. He was immersed in himself, and there was deep sadness on his face. She felt his gaze, full of understatement and anxiety, but did not dare to ask what happened. She tried to behave as usual, but her heart ached with the premonition that their lives would not be the same anymore. For James, these days were a real test. He tried to hold on, but there were questions in his head that he couldn't answer. Why did she go back to Marcus? Why did she miss him, James? All this tormented him, keeping him awake at night. He understood that Dorothy was no longer with him, that her thoughts were somewhere far away, but he did not know how to bring her back. Every night he lay next to her, feeling her warmth, and thought that a wall had grown between them that he could not overcome. Several painful days passed, full of unbearable silence and hidden tension. James still couldn't make up his mind to have a frank conversation with Dorothy, even though he knew it was inevitable. He felt betrayed, cheated, and lost, as if all the years they had spent together had been nothing more than an illusion. It seemed that every evening spent with Dorothy was saturated with an unbearable feeling of emptiness and alienness. Despite the fact that they lived under the same roof, that her scent, her touch, seemed to remain the same, something had changed subtly but forever. Every night, when they went to bed, James lay staring into the darkness, feeling her next to him, but realizing that her thoughts, her soul, were all somewhere far away. She became like a stranger. He tried to recall the images of their life together, as if he could find some clue in them that could bring Dorothy back. I remembered their youth, their children, holidays and everyday moments. All of this now seemed to be just a series of paintings, unrelated to each other. James realized that their relationship, no matter how hard he tried, was built on a routine that he had always considered reliable, but which now turned out to be an empty shell. He began to see a tinge of longing in her that he hadn't noticed before. Dorothy had always been a little thoughtful, prone to reflection, but now her gaze was absorbed in something that James could not understand. This deep sadness was mixed with a kind of inner light that he had not seen in her for a long time. Now that light belonged to someone else, and this feeling was slowly but surely devouring him from within. At some point, James decided that he could no longer remain silent. He needed to know the truth, despite all his fears. He understood that his life could change forever, but he could not live in ignorance. One evening, when Dorothy returned from another walk, he noticed how her eyes shone with a kind of secret joy, as if she carried a fire in her that was alien to their life together. This was the last straw for him. James's heart was beating heavily when he finally decided to speak. He began the conversation cautiously, trying to choose words that would not hurt her and perhaps ruin their marriage completely. But the more he tried to be careful, the clearer it became that his words, like jagged shards, were piercing into their once whole relationship. When he asked her directly what was going on, there was something like fright and at the same time relief in her eyes. He felt that it was excruciatingly difficult for her to hide her secret, and finally she realized that she would not be able to hide it anymore. Her face, which he had once known down to the smallest detail, now seemed completely unfamiliar to him. Dorothy did not cry, did not argue, did not deny that something had happened between her and Marcus. She just stared at James, trying to find words that could explain her feelings, her need for something else, for something real. But no matter what words she chose, every word felt like a hammer blow to his heart. James was aware that anger was building inside him. Anger for all the years he'd thought he knew her. Anger for all the times he'd put up with the mundane, when he hadn't tried to make changes in their lives, thinking it was acceptable for her too. He felt cheated. But the most painful thing was the realization that her needs, her personal desires, had remained a mystery to him all these years. He was shocked by how much she longed to go back to the past, how much she needed something he couldn't give her. For Dorothy, this moment was no less painful. She understood that she no longer had the right to remain silent, that her inner conflict was something that concerned not only her, but also James, with whom she had lived for many years. She struggled with herself, feeling a deep sense of guilt. At some point she realized that her duty to James, their family, their life together, all this is now under threat. She wanted to explain to him that her meetings with Marcus were not part of some insidious plan or deliberate betrayal, but were just an attempt to regain a lost sense of herself, to return to the part of herself that she had buried during the years of marriage. But no matter how she tried to express her feelings, James saw in her words only confirmation of his worst fears. He felt his trust crumbling, his belief that he was everything to her. There was genuine regret in Dorothy's eyes, but it wasn't enough for him. There was a deep-rooted feeling in his heart that everything they had together was now irretrievably lost. He saw love and pain in her eyes at the same time, but this only aggravated his own suffering, making it sharper and more unbearable. After this conversation, an unimaginable distance grew between them. It seemed that their house, once cozy and warm, was now filled with cold and tension. James couldn't get rid of thoughts of Marcus, couldn't forget the look on Dorothy's face when she confessed that this man had reawakened something in her that he hadn't seen for a long time. He understood that it was partly his fault that they were both mired in routine, but his pride and pain did not allow him to easily forgive or understand her act. The days dragged on, and they spent every evening together without saying a word. They both felt that words would be superfluous. Each of them had already said everything they could, but the silence was no less painful. James felt his love for Dorothy turning into something heavy and painful, not allowing him to leave or stay. Their every look was full of reproaches and understatement, every gesture, an accidental touch, all this became a symbol of their broken union. For Dorothy, this time became unbearable, but at the same time she realized that perhaps this was a chance for her to see what she really wanted. She felt that she could no longer be the wife who lived for comfort and habit, but at the same time she realized that she was destroying the only life she and James had created together. They were both trapped in their feelings, misunderstandings, and resentments. Everyone tried to find a way out in their own way, but all attempts only made them even more alienated from each other. Dorothy lived like in a dream, slowly and heavily, as if every new day required her to make an effort just to move forward. Anxious thoughts seemed to envelop her mind in a fog, leaving her only doubts and uncertainty about the correctness of her actions. She tried to find a balance between her life with James and her renewed love for Marcus, but instead she only plunged deeper into the chaos of her own experiences. From time to time she was overcome by the determination to leave everything behind, go back to James and try to start over from scratch. She convinced herself that stability and reliability were more important than any romantic fantasies, and that her duty to her husband, with whom they had lived most of their lives, should be stronger than fleeting passion. But every time she tried to imagine herself as a caring wife, forgetting about her personal desires, her heart literally stopped, as if she was again imprisoning herself in a familiar but already hated routine. Deep down, she knew that despite her best efforts, her relationship with James could no longer be the same as before. Their life together, of course, was full of the usual joys and sorrows that they shared while supporting each other. She knew that he was a reliable man, that he was always there for her. But when she remembered how her heart skipped a beat when she looked at Marcus, how all this family comfort and home seemed to her like a gloomy cage, she was tormented by the thought that her attraction to Marcus was tearing her apart from the inside, that her affection for James was turning into a sense of duty and responsibility, and not into the love she once felt. With each passing day, Dorothy became more and more immersed in her contradictions, trying to find a way that would not hurt anyone, but she realized that such a path simply did not exist. Whatever choice she makes, someone will get hurt, and maybe all three of them will be victims of this difficult situation. She couldn't give up on James, she couldn't break his heart, but she also couldn't forget what had awakened in her next to Marcus. There was a real battle going on in her soul between loyalty and passion, between duty and the thirst for freedom. Her house became a haunted place for her. Every single thing in it, the photos on the walls, the books on the shelves, the dishes in the kitchen, all reminded her of the years she spent with James, of all those days they lived side by side. On the one hand, she couldn't imagine her life without all these familiar things, without James, who was always her mainstay, especially in difficult times. On the other hand, every glance at familiar places and faces reminded her that perhaps she had missed something important in this life, that her dreams and ambitions had remained unfulfilled. Her thoughts returned to Marcus every time she was alone with herself. With him she was different, strong, confident, alive. He gave her something she couldn't find in her everyday life. remembering their last meetings when Marcus held her hand, when they looked at each other in complete silence, but in that silence more was said than words. She understood that he saw in her not just a woman, but a person with his own desires and aspirations. She couldn't help but think that next to him she would gain that sense of fullness that she had lost in everyday life. But at the same time she was filled with fear, the fear of losing everything she and James had created over the years. She recalled how they built a house, how they raised children together, how they helped each other in illnesses and sorrows. She knew that James was a good husband and a reliable partner, that he would never betray her. She tried to console herself with the thought that their family was something worth living for, that a fleeting infatuation with Marcus was not worth a ruined relationship with a man who had always been devoted to her. One evening, when James was late at work, Dorothy picked up an old photo album and began flipping through the pages. Her whole life was captured in these pictures, the moments they spent together, joyful and sad events, the days when they were young and happy. She looked at the photos and tried to remember what it was like to be carefree, in love, how she loved him, how they built their dreams together. But now these photos seemed to her only a reminder that her life was not entirely her own. She was aware that her feelings for James had changed, that perhaps she no longer felt the love that she had before. At some point, Dorothy realized that she needed to see Marcus again. She went to the park, knowing she could meet him there. This park became for her a symbol of her inner freedom, a place where she could be herself, without obligations and boundaries. When she arrived there, she felt a slight excitement, as if she had met him for the first time. Marcus was there, waiting for her, and in his eyes she saw the same warmth and support she had always felt around him. He hugged her, and in that embrace she felt alive again. This time, their meeting was full of silence. They sat side by side, holding hands, and each of them realized that this moment could be the last. Dorothy knew that she couldn't continue living a lie, that she had to make a decision, but this choice was too hard for her. She understood that whatever path she chose, she would have to live with the consequences of her decision. Returning home, Dorothy realized that she could no longer pretend. Her inner world was being torn apart, and it was becoming unbearable. She knew that she was going to have a difficult conversation with James, that she needed to explain to him her feelings, her pain, her contradictions. She realized that perhaps their marriage would not stand up to this conversation, but she could no longer live on hiding her true feelings. The next morning, Dorothy woke up with a determination that was mixed with a feeling of heaviness in her heart. She realized that she could no longer live in a state of expectation and uncertainty. She could not continue her gap between duty and thirst for life. Her inner voice, which had been in the shadows for so long, finally spoke with full force, demanding truth and determination. As soon as she realized that her life could not go on as before, she was overcome by a strange feeling of freedom, but also fear of what awaits her after this decision. She understood that any step she took would lead to devastating consequences, that her choice would bring pain, but she could no longer ignore herself. Dorothy realized that she had been living for others for too long, hiding her true desires and dreams behind a mask of calmness and devotion to her family. But now she had to make a choice that would change not only her life, but also the lives of James and Marcus. She spent the whole day thinking, not finding a place for herself. She considered every possible outcome of her decision, trying to figure out what was more important to her, to preserve what she had built with James, or to allow herself to immerse herself in a new life with Marcus, allowing herself the freedom that she had always lacked. But even as she tried to imagine life with Marcus, images of James, their home, their children, everything they had created together over the years invaded her mind. She felt that her life with him was real and meaningful, that their marriage, despite all the routine, was full of sincere feelings. By evening, her resolve began to weaken. It seemed to her that she was returning to her inner division again, losing control of her desires again. She understood that her future depended on finding the strength to go all the way, that if she took one wrong step, she could lose both Marcus and James and be left alone, broken and devastated. But the realization is maturing in her soul. A life without risk and without self-acceptance will not bring her happiness. Realizing this, she finally decides to talk to James, deciding to be completely honest with him, despite the fear and possible consequences. When James returned home, Dorothy met him in the living room, sitting by the window. He noticed her thoughtful, distant gaze, her hands, which were nervously intertwined in her lap. There was something unusual in her posture, in her eyes, and he felt that the moment he had been dreading all these weeks had arrived. James sat down across from her, and in the silence that hung between them, he realized that she was finally ready to tell him the whole truth. Dorothy began by explaining how her feelings had changed in recent months, how meeting Marcus had awakened in her what she thought had long been forgotten. She talked about her inner struggle, that she didn't want to hurt him, but she couldn't continue to ignore her real feelings. She was telling him the truth about her love for Marcus, about the feelings she had experienced with him, about how it made her feel like herself again. For James, her words were like blows, each of which destroyed his faith in their future together. He listened to her without interrupting, but there was pain and disappointment in his eyes. It seemed to him that his life was being destroyed right before his eyes, that every moment of their past, all the years they had spent together, had now become only fleeting memories. When she finished speaking, he got up and left without saying a word, leaving her alone. James did not return home that night. Dorothy spent it alone, sitting in the kitchen, surrounded by silence which weighed on her more and more every minute. She understood that she had ruined their relationship, that her confession had left him devastated and broken. It was hard for her to realize that her desire for freedom had led to such destruction that she had lost not only her former life, but also the person who had been with her for many years. James returned the next day. There was no longer the same softness in his eyes. His face was stony. His gaze was cold. He told her that he couldn't go on living like this, that he couldn't forgive her for betraying him. His words were harsh, but there was no malice in them, only bitterness and a sense of loss. He admitted that he felt devastated and betrayed, that he couldn't figure out how it all happened. Dorothy listened to him, realizing that their story was over, that her desire for freedom and a new life had destroyed everything they had built together. A few weeks later, James packed up and left. Dorothy was left alone in an empty house that reminded her of everything she had lost. Now her life was deprived of its former stability, and she had to re-find her way, her inner strength. She tried to justify herself by telling herself that she had done the right thing, that her choice was inevitable, but it did not bring her relief. She felt that she was alone, that her new life, which she imagined with Marcus, was not what she imagined it to be. Marcus, having learned about Dorothy's breakup with James, suggested that she move in with him, start a life together. But even in this sentence, Dorothy felt a strange sense of emptiness. She realized that her dream of freedom and happiness with Marcus was just an illusion, an attempt to escape from herself. It was hard for her to admit to herself, but she realized that her feelings for Marcus were not as deep as she thought. She began to realize that her love for him was just an attempt to return to the past, to find herself, but this attempt led her to lose the present. After a while, Dorothy decides to leave town. Her house, filled with memories, became unbearable for her. She felt that she needed to start from scratch, to find her way without James and Marcus, to find her true independence, which she had been looking for so long. A feeling of emptiness settled inside her, but at the same time it was also a feeling of liberation. She realized that her path to self was not over yet, that she had a long way to go to find her inner peace and harmony. After leaving the city, Dorothy started a new life. She traveled, met new people, tried to find herself in a new environment. She no longer aspired to a relationship, to affection. She realized that the most important thing for her was to gain inner freedom, to learn to live for herself, and not for others. A shadow of past memories remained in her heart, but now she perceived them as part of her life experience, and not as a basis for the future. It took several years before Dorothy was able to truly let go of her past. She learned to appreciate her loneliness, her inner peace, her strength. She realized that her search for freedom and happiness was part of her life path, that every decision, even if it brought pain, led her to understand herself. In the end, she found the harmony she had been looking for so long, and realize that her true happiness was in herself and not in a relationship or attachment to someone.